Welcome to IVF This, episode 130, IVF and stress responses. I am just flabbergasted that we are at 130 episodes. That is just insanity to me. And in November, so just a few months away, this podcast will be 3 years old. Still does not compute. Every time I say the podcast number when I'm doing my introduction, it's just like, I just have this wave of gratitude. Like none of this would be possible without you guys listening, without you guys subscribing or following, or, depending on the platform that you choose. So I just want to take a quick thank you. 130 for any podcast is massive. This podcast, IVF This in general, has over 100,000 unique downloads. I have just the biggest wave of gratitude for each and every one of you, for my producer, Anthony, my lovely, lovely dear friend who has to deal with this agent of chaos that is speaking to you right now and remind me many times, my wonderful virtual assistant, Ella. You guys, this is a group effort to be sure. I know y'all hear me and my ideas and my concepts, but there is much more that goes into this podcast. So at number 130, which is ridiculous to think about, I just want to thank everybody. I adore you all. Thank you so much. And we're going to talk about something that everyone wants to talk about. Stress responses. Okay. Now you might not think of them as stress responses. You might only know them, or might most commonly know them as fight, flight, freeze. And some people know, but there is a fourth one called fawn. And I'm going to talk about all those in just a moment. But some people know them as trauma responses. Some people know them as stress responses. I want to be very careful when we talk about these things, in that not everything is trauma. Okay. Stress is an integral aspect of trauma. Okay. Your body is almost under constant stress in and following a trauma. But stress can exist outside of trauma. And that's why I refer to them as stress responses, not trauma responses. If you refer to them as trauma responses, that's absolutely fine. If your therapist or your counselor refers to them as trauma responses, that's not a problem either. This is just the way I choose to describe them and how I choose to explain them and things like that. So just a really, really clear delineator. We're talking about the same things, whether it's stress response, whether it's trauma response, whether it's fight or flight, whether it's fight, flight, or freeze, whether it is fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. All of those things, we're talking about the same thing. We are talking about the autonomic or automatic system in your body that it has been designed for survival. That's the TLDR, my friends. That's it. That's what it is, right? There are hormonal experiences associated with each of those responses: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. It can change your digestive process. They can give you more energy into your bloodstream. They can cause heart palpitations, or your heart racing, not necessarily palpitations, beating faster, respirations, your breathing can increase, right? All of these are automatic things that are happening in your body. So when we talk about, and I'm going to give you some concrete examples of stress responses. But number one, the reason that it's important to understand and acknowledge that these are the things that are happening and why. And I say this a million times. This could be another aspect of the IVF This drinking game. I know compassion was one for a long time. I just want you to be aware. I want to give you context for what is happening and why. Okay. Now, whether you think that it logically makes sense, that's irrelevant. A few podcast episodes back, I was really honing in, emotions are not a logical experience. They can work together, but if you are in the throes of, let's say, a stress response, it's not a logic issue. Okay. It's not, you have to feel this. You have to experience this emotion. It's not going to stop just because you can logic test it or logic challenge it. Okay. So that's really important to understand. Now, the reason this is a podcast episode at all, because like 130 podcast episodes in, I've never really talked about it, is because this is an aspect of my group coaching cohort. And over the last couple of weeks, one of the things that we've been talking about is the central nervous system. I think it's really important to understand the central nervous system so that you can understand when these things happen and it doesn't feel like, one, you're dying, two, you're doing anything wrong, and three, when you can understand that these are like automatic things that are happening. It's not like I'm out of control. It's like, oh, my body is doing something without me co-signing it. And so my job is just to try to get myself back grounded, get myself back neutral, calm my central nervous system. And so we were talking about it. I had done a class and describing like polyvagal theory. If that's something that's interesting to you, I can absolutely do a podcast episode on it in the future. But the crux of it is when I was talking about, this is what's happening in your central nervous system and this is how it's showing up, and it shows up by these responses. And I just said fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. That was it. And someone raised their hand in the group and they were like, can you tell me a little bit about fawn? And so I did. And everyone was kind of looking at me like, I understand that they understand, right? It was not an intellectual thing. What I was seeing in their kind of responses and their facial features and some of the, furrowed brows and stuff was that they were that they were having difficulty seeing how it could actually apply in their life. Like they know it. Again, it's not an intellect thing, but having a concrete example was helpful or would be helpful for them, right? So I pulled out my trusted whiteboard and I went through everything, every single example, everything that I could think of, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, how it can show up and how you can actually experience more than one stress response at a time. And even if you're, let's say, you can experience like fight and flight together, it's not necessarily just one. Okay. And I think that that's a misnomer around kind of how these responses look like. Like you're only gonna, if flight is your go-to, right, then that might look like you're just running away. And that's the only thing you're going to do. And that's not necessarily true. Okay. So I want to give you a few examples. I'm going to read them off of a list so that I don't forget. It was a little bit of a struggle bus with my group trying to pull back from my, 20 years ago when I was in graduate school for these things. So, okay. So I'm going to read them off. I'm going to start with fight. And if you are interested and you want to take notes, that's perfectly fine. Just know that I'm going to stay in one category and then I'm going to go to the next and I'll announce it every time. Okay. So fight, which happens to be your girl's favorite go-to stress response, much to the chagrin of my amazing husband, because I will fight under every circumstance. But examples of fight are anger, right? Aggressiveness. It can also look like control, right? For me, when I'm feeling dysregulated or if I'm feeling defensive or something like that, I might turn to control, which is actually an aspect of fight, right? It's so interesting. Manipulation, right? Which is control in and of itself, but it's just a different way to think about it. Fight might also look like the bully. I can also be a bully. Not as much as I used to be, but it comes out in very specific ways when I'm very, very dysregulated, when I'm very angry, when I'm very frustrated. It looks like judgment. Fight is judgment. Judgment about yourself, judgment about other people. It can look like slamming doors or just like this underlying irritability, right? This like, you just feel like you're being abrasive, right? That's an aspect of that stress response fight. It can also be an aspect of your personality. I know that there are people in this world that are, by all accounts, just kind of abrasive people. I've been described as an abrasive person, someone who you either love or hate, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about in the throes of really powerful or really stressful experience, you're exhibiting these things outside of maybe your normal behavior or normal characteristics, normal personality, things like that. Another aspect of fight is you can't even comprehend there is another point of view. And this goes back to like the bulliness, the aggressiveness, the controlling things. That's still an aspect of fight, right? So it's not just like throwing blows or putting hands on someone. It's much more subtle than I think most people understand. Okay. So that's fight. And I'm only doing a few examples. I want to make that known. These are just a few of the examples that you can find on what fight could look like from like a concrete example way. So let's do flight. Okay. So most people think of flight as running away, right? But that can show up as being a workaholic. Maybe you are just throwing yourself into work because your home is empty. And that is a terrifying thing to come home to at night, or a sad thing to come home to at night. So you flight to work and just throw yourself into work. It looks like perfectionism, right? Because you can never quite get there. Perfectionism, that's the illusion of perfectionism, right? There's always something better, or there's always something you could do to improve. And so that can be an aspect of flight. Rumination. Oh, my loves, rumination. Okay. You are staying stuck in your head. You're living your life in your head. That's another way that my stress responses come out. I live in my head, right? And I can get angry. Like I can do both. You're going to find as we go through these 4 examples that you're going to have tendencies out of every single category. There's not going to be one category I wouldn't imagine that you probably haven't seen or could see yourself doing, right? Overachieving. Ooh, so many of my clients have this like overachieving type A perfectionist tendency. I don't know if that's just the person I attract or if that's just how, and more of my belief system, that is how most women have been socialized to behave, right? You might be prone to overeating or over drinking. I don't want to say like addictive behaviors. Some people could, it's fine. But things like, things like overeating, right? You've had a terrible day. And so you go home and eat all 4 sleeves of the Oreo container. That's a flight tendency. That's a flight stress response. Because that's a way of getting you away from the situation. Because the situation is happening in your brain. It's not like physically, there's a physical danger. And that's what I think that the biggest misconceptions, because that's where these things evolved, was like the physical danger that we would have to fight or flight or freeze or fawn over. Okay. So I don't want you to think about like, if I'm eating to like for comfort, that is a stress response. It's not a morally bankrupt aspect of yourself. It has nothing to do with morality. It has everything to do with stress and how your brain and your body are trying to keep you safe from that stress. And so overeating, drinking, other drugs, things like that, those are stress responses. Those are flight. You're just trying to get away. If you can't physically get away, you're just trying to create distance in your brain, space in your brain. Okay. Another one for flight would be isolation. How many of us have socially isolated because of what we're going through? That is a normal stress response. Again, doesn't mean anything about yourself, doesn't mean anything about you as a friend or person. 0. It means that you're going through an inordinately, a terribly stressful time. And this is how your brain is trying to keep you safe. It's saying if we isolate, if we have more control, then we get to be safe. And again, these are just a few examples, not a comprehensive list, but that's flight. So freeze. And this is actually the earliest stress response. And you can see it now even still in animals like possums. Their response is to freeze, play possum. They fall over and they pretend that they're dead. That was the first survival mechanism, survival stress response that we ever had as creatures, as human beings, as a species. Okay. So this is also very common. All of them are very common, but freeze tends to look different than, no. And just like all the other ones, freeze looks different than how we would imagine, right? We think of freeze, we think of freezing, like in our spot. That's not how it looks. Okay. It can look like disassociation, living in your head, right? Another, whether it's fight and I know I mentioned in flight, kind of living in your head. And again, there's like a Venn diagram, and some of these really do overlap, and that's okay. We don't have to put them like in a perfect compartment, and just knowing that these are happening, okay? But living in your head, that disassociation, fairy tales, dreaming, daydreaming, all of those things, those are the freeze response. Maybe staying silent when there's a conflict, staying silent when someone says something very rude or obnoxious or obscene about your journey or sex in regards to like having children or making babies. I remember that one of my mother-in-law's friends told my husband, "When are you going to do your manly duty and get her knocked up?" I remember that. So I remember the words verbatim. I remember where I was standing when she said that. And then I said nothing in that moment. And that was a freeze response. I don't know what I would have said that would have been like graceful. Anything, I would have chosen violence in that moment, whether it was verbally or physically. But my response in that moment was freeze. And that's okay, right? I was flabbergasted. I couldn't believe it. Another one is freeze laying on the couch for hours at a time. It's an aspect of dissociation, right? But you're literally freezing. Can't move. Don't want to move. There's no movement happening, right? Your body is like, we have to freeze. We have to pause. There's too much input. There's too much. It's overwhelming right now. And so we have to freeze. So then you find yourself watching, 15 episodes of Bridgerton in one sitting. Don't think that that's a personal example or anything, but that's what's happening. Okay. Zoning out, right? Disassociation, right? Couch potato, indecisiveness, right? I'm stuck. I can't get out of this. I don't know what to do. I don't know what decision to make, right? It can also be isolation. Freeze can also be isolation. It can show up that way, just like it did with flight. Feeling numb, feeling empty. Also signs of depression, but without that pathology, right? Without a clinical framework for that numbness, it could be a stress response. Okay. And then the last one that I typically get the most questions about, and I certainly did in my group coaching, and that's fawn. And that's the people pleasing aspect of the stress responses. And the example I gave, you see it a lot in domestic violence, right? In narcissistic, abusive relationships like that. Outside of the extremes, such as domestic violence, it can still show up. Okay, so it would show up like codependency. That actually happens a lot in substance abuse relationships. Not exclusive to, but happens a lot. Inability to stand up for yourself. You fear upsetting people, right? I'm going to make them mad. I'm going to disappoint them. That's a fawn response. Poor boundaries. Ooh, that's a big one. And I think fawn, for a lot of people, what people think about and the way that our cultural lexicon has kind of shifted towards more therapy speak, which I have my own thoughts about, but anyway. But I think that understanding this is that these stress responses don't just come out of nowhere. There are events in your life that doing that has kept you safe, which is why you continue doing it. Okay. And that's a really important thing that I want you to remember. Okay. Especially when we're talking about fawn, because I think that since most people don't realize that it's a stress response and certainly don't realize concrete examples of how it shows up, we tend to judge ourselves a lot for people pleasing because of how, everybody talks about boundaries now. Boundaries is like the key word. Everyone talks about how you have to take care of yourself and don't people please and things like that. And so I think that because it's now more so much more in our social awareness and social consciousness, that these are things that you can easily beat up yourself for, and you don't need to. They're there for a reason. They've kept you safe. So that's all I'll say on that. But avoiding conflict, looks to others for decisions. I had a client we recently wrapped up, and she's so lovely. But in sessions, when I was asking her what she thought about things or what she believed about things, specifically about her, we had her close her eyes, because when her eyes were open, all of a sudden it was like all of this internal monologue that didn't belong to her would come in. Like the voices, the voice of her family members was louder than the voice in her head. And so in order to cut that off, we had to close her eyes. How many of you guys go through the same conversation and ask the same questions to 2 people, 3 people, 5 people, only for everyone to come to a similar conclusion, or for you to have known the entire time and you're just trying to just farm out some answers, because it's very difficult for you to make a decision for yourself, to stand by that decision, because you have to take into consideration everybody else, even people who's not going to be affected by that decision. That is a fawn response. Okay. So I hope this was helpful for you, to just give you an idea of what's happening. If you're interested in learning more about polyvagal theory and the central nervous system, I can absolutely do a podcast on that. But more importantly, when these happen, the thing that you're going to be doing is just going to be reminding yourself, that's what's happening. I'm really stressed. I'm really angry. I'm really frustrated. I'm really overwhelmed. And I'm doing this thing as a result of that, not because there's something wrong with me as a person, not some sort of moral failing or something like that. It's not a morality issue. If these are automatic responses, then that's what's happening automatically. It's what your body is saying. Oh my God, my brain is telling me there's danger, and this is what I'm doing to try and keep myself alive. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing moral about that. So it's not a question of you not doing something right or doing it wrong. It's just a question of, this is what my brain and my body have decided to do in order to keep me alive. Might not be the most productive thing, and the risk might not have been to your bodily harm, but it was there for a reason, and we can take care of ourselves, right? Ooh, I spent, 4 hours on the couch yesterday afternoon when I could have been doing X, Y, and Z. Instead of where you might have used that against yourself, right? I hate when I do that. I just wasted a day. You could also choose to reframe it to like, wow, I guess I really needed that. I really needed that time. I really needed that space. Really needed that decompression, or however you want to say it. But it can also be something that your body and your brain did need, because there was a perception of danger, emotional, psychological, physical, all of those things. Okay, so I hope that gives you a good idea. My group was very excited that they now had concrete examples. It was a lot of aha moments in some of the things that I was talking about, because again, when you just think of them as these like giant umbrellas, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, that doesn't necessarily give you an idea of how it could specifically show up for you. So I hope that this episode has done that for you. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Have a beautiful week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.